Our next session is really focusing on data specifications and standards. There are multiple data standard efforts out there. Some are backed by government, some are backed by specific organizations, some are backed by mobility data organizations and foundations. And we want to better understand what does that landscape look like and where are we headed? So I've asked several luminaries in the field to help us today in looking at this question. The first speaker in this session is Paula Okuniev. Let's just make sure that she's joined us. Polly Okuniev has over 38 years of experience as a systems, business, and data analyst, with 30 of those years developing integrated systems and enterprise architectures, strategic plans, operational concepts, technical designs, and specifications to deploy multimodal and accessible transportation systems. Polly's been involved in developing and applying standards and open specifications to multimodal travel, mobility solutions for all Americans, integrated fare, open and account-based payment systems, fleet management, CAD AVL, radio communications, transit signal priority, and integrated corridor management. These efforts were agency, regional, and national in scope for a variety of organizations, including USDOT, FTA, King County Metro, Ride Gwinnett, and New York State DOT. Polly is a US expert to international standards organizations, technical committee TC, working groups, and working group 8 on public transport and emergency, and working group 19 on mobility integration since 1996. She chairs the working group 8 public transport subworking group and on data integration. Please allow me to welcome Polly.
Thank you, Anat.
And Polly will speak about a review of projects related to multimodal and accessible transportation standards run by, I believe, USDOT.
Thank you for inviting me, Anat. I'm really pleased to present on 3 standards, 3 projects. I work for the Joint Program Office, as well as some international standards work that we're initiating in the next couple of years. The 3 projects that I've been working on over the past few years with the Joint Program Office on intelligent transportation systems include something called Multimodal and Accessible Travel Standards Assessment through ICF from 2019 to 2021, ITS Architecture Development, Evolution, and Deployment Support project, which is primed by ITIRIS, currently underway. They're developing the ITS architecture. And then in ITE project, the Institute of Transportation Engineers, multimodal and accessible transportation standards and vulnerable road users cybersecurity support project. That's quite a mouthful. All these standards look at, so the first project, if you go to the next slide, was looking at the gaps in standards that support multimodal and accessible travel standards. So if you click forward, so there were 5 papers that were written. The first was a forward-looking assessment of multimodal and accessible travel, looking at user needs, because we wanted to see what kinds of projects and systems different organizations were using to address the issue of multimodal and accessible travel. And this paper is, you can find on the USDOT website. The second and 5th study, if you click forward, was a survey of existing standards that related to that forward-looking assessment. The categories that were described there, we did a survey of standards that were being deployed not only standards, but also specifications by grassroots or community organizations that were put out, that were open and available for anybody to use. We identified over 300 standards, including profiles or flexibility, the personalization of some of these standards to apply to specific use cases or end systems, end users, or end uses. And so this document is also on the USDOT website. We came up with a typology of how to describe this based on the open systems interconnect model, where you have different layers of standards that need to work together to implement some kind of behavior like communications or APIs or so on, because one standard doesn't meet all the requirements. It becomes very complex, and so we define the different layers associated with the kinds of standards that needed to support MAT capabilities. We also did an outreach report. So if you click forward, and this outreach report, we went to over 300 or so. We went to like 5 organizations where we surveyed the organizations. We also interviewed specific organizations and people about the gaps in how they develop projects and what kind of gaps they have as users of these applications, to identify where there were gaps in the standards, where standards didn't meet their requirements. We did a broad brush. We went to advocacy groups. We went to organizations for people with disabilities and different organizations with people with disabilities. We talked to bike advocates, and we talked to pedestrian advocates. We talked to Complete Streets and universal design advocates to identify what kind of issues there were. We also talked to standards organizations and specification organizations to identify any kind of opportunities for harmonizing standards that weren't talking to each other or didn't interface with each other, about how there could be migration to a single, or at least a transformation from one standard to another. A good example of this is if one organization uses time in one format and another organization uses the ISO standard for time, how do you map those two different standards together? If you want to use one for one aspect of your deployment and want to use another one for another aspect of your deployment. And then we developed a roadmap or strategic plan, so click forward, that identified a framework and several strategies and initiatives that the USDOT could take in order to fill those standards gap. So if you could go on to the next slide. The categories that we came up with for the gaps revolved around 2 areas. One was complete trip and one was complete street. And we kind of adopted the definition that the USDOT uses for complete trip, which identifies each action, each transition, each leg process that encompasses a door-to-door or a trip without any gaps between that. And it covered all the transition from one mode to another. We came up with 4 groups of, or 4 categories that we would define those standards in. The first one was on-demand and mobility platform, mostly the application programming interfaces. that are associated with ensuring that. We didn't want to get too much into the technology and the application and the intellectual property of the applications, but we did want to focus on the kind of information that needs to be transferred from one system, or the transactions that need to occur from one system to another. We looked at wayfinding and navigation. This is more along the lines of, if I want to go from one place to another, how do I get there? What's the step-by-step directions, not just door to door, not just leg to leg, but step by step, because that focused on the accessibility needs of the traveler to personalize their travel experience. We also looked at safety, and this is where the connected vehicle and the vulnerable road user issues came up with. How do you ensure vision zero performance, where you keep people safe and they remain safe? We looked at some of the connected vehicle applications, and most of them focused on the pedestrian or the traveler as a passive object. And we turned that around and said, well, we need more information about how a pedestrian or a vulnerable road user can be an active participant in this connected environment. And then we also looked at integrated payment and the needs that were the gaps in standards that were missing from that. Move on to the next slide. And for complete streets, we looked at kind of the complete streets in the current implementation by USDOT is more of a design practice, but we saw the need to build this information infrastructure and the kinds of information that could be digitized and represented in the applications. And going back to Karen, to what you were saying is, where are the semantic definitions for these kinds of features that are in the pedestrian right-of-way environment, in the curbs? Also, what are the rules and regulations that manage the curb and other kinds of micromobility vehicles, including bicycles, e-bikes, e-scooters, and the kind of capabilities? How does perhaps a wheelchair talk to the environment as well? And what kind of infrastructure is going to be put in its place? And one of the other areas is, well, how do you represent that information? How do you model it? How do you model it for outdoor spaces? And how do you model it for indoor spaces, so that so you could have a door-to-door trip plan even through buildings? So we looked at those gap categories, and then we came up with recommendations. So if you go to the next slide. We came up this is the framework that we used and the initiatives that surrounded it. So the first initiative was to deal with the institutional and programmatic drivers that addressed that who was going to be invited to these standard development organizations. And Karen, I really appreciate your comment that you need to include the lived experience in this. We recommended that advocacy groups, people with accessibility challenges, be included as well, because those kinds of issues are key to personalize this, to make sure that the right information is collected and categorized and assigned conditions that are consistent across all applications. And so that was one of the key initiatives that we suggested. We also said, well, we're missing a lot of the drivers that support the needs of travelers. So we don't have ITS architecture, reference models, or service packages. We don't have the use cases that define how the information should be exchanged, especially when you come to transactional information. Reservations is a good example of that. Then we don't have the semantics. We don't have the terminology and a consistent definition of what that terminology is. We don't know how those terms and those concepts are related to each other, and that's where the schema comes in. And then how do we take that information and translate it into a message and specification? And really the message and specification is where the standards come in, because that's the initial part of the standard. And then the initiative 3 are the standard communications for how that information is exchanged. A lot of that is already existing, but somebody asked the question about translation for OSM from the data that people collect to OSM and the guidelines that are needed to do that. There's a transformation between the messages and specification and the data to go from one standard to another, and that's initiative 4. Where initiative 4 is not only do you need training on what the standards are about, but how to take those standards and encode them with real information, and what are the downstream uses of that data, and what kind of requirements you need to associate with that data. A good example are intersections, where OSM has multiple ways of defining intersections for pedestrian right-of-ways. In most cases, it's a center line, as opposed to at each 4 corners having a separate line that goes around or across those intersections in the right direction, where people actually walk and where the signals allow for pedestrians to have the right-of-way. So, and then the final one was innovation, research, and support tools. And I can't advocate enough the need to have support tools, both to collect the data and to access the data, so that, because in and of itself, those kind of support tools help build consistency for encoding the data. I mean, you don't always get that capability, but in many cases you do. And so that's what we were looking for. So if you go to the next one. So that was the MATSA project. Out of the MATSA project came the recommendation for updating the national ITS architecture, which is called the reference ITS architecture. And the short name for it is the ARCIT. And so currently underway is an effort to update the ARCIT with new multimodal and accessible transportation elements to address the issues or the gaps that were brought up in the MATSA project. So vulnerable road users, pedestrians, and micro mobility vehicles. Currently, there are pedestrians and bikes, so there's going to be an expansion and a categorization of bikes that are associated with micro mobility vehicles. There's wayfinding, which will deal with pathways, the public right-of-ways, as well as indoor and outdoor navigation, as well as the transition from indoor to outdoor and vice versa. One of the major obstacles for accessible travel, accessible trip information is, well, I need to get to a door that I could actually enter. And I think, Karen, you had mentioned that in your keynote speech as well. Then there was the shared use fleets. That wasn't very well represented it's not very well represented in the current architecture. and also payment integration. And a series of use cases similar to what is done for standard. The architecture, the reference architecture, also has a set of use cases to understand how people use or apply how they behave, so that the architecture can represent the services that they need to have represented. Go to the next slide. So another project that came out of MATSA was this ITE, MAT, and VRU standards development, where it's looking at identifying gaps in standards and the organizations that should be brought together to coordinate the addressing of those gaps. The project includes 5 major tasks. The first task was to develop a white paper on cybersecurity and privacy. And this is focused on standards, of course. So these are the standards that are needed and the guidance that's needed by MAT projects, the Multimodal and Accessible Travel Standards projects, to apply the existing standards and any kind of gaps that may be in that domain. We also looked at MAT use cases. The architecture team went first, and so we pulled in their use cases, but we also looked at over 50 projects that have been developed in the US through USDOT, including FTA as well as JPO projects in this area. We looked at some international projects as well and the work that they're doing, especially when they try to implement standards into those projects and the results of those projects. We did an analysis of what we thought the gaps were. From there, we identified a plan. We developed 4 white papers that looked at topics, drilled down into who the stakeholders were, what kind of standards were being developed, and what the best approach was for coordinating those types of standards. And I'll go into a little bit more detail in the next slide about that. And we then developed a coordination plan for who should be involved, how they should be involved. We looked at a whole range of stakeholders there, from advocacy groups to grassroots groups to high visible projects to standard developers to end users and third-party and application developers. Who should be involved. This is still ongoing, so there's not much I could talk about this. And then we're also in the process of developing an operational readiness framework that looks at standards. We're looking at technical integration readiness, operational readiness, and cybersecurity readiness. And we're developing an approach that's consistent with other readiness levels that would be consistent with that. If you can go on to the next slide. So the 4 white paper topics that we looked at were standard gaps for VRUs in the connected intersection and roadside. So this is focused on the how to improve the intersection for vulnerable road users and what kind of technologies they can use to support their use of intersections in a safe manner. We wrote a paper on public right-of-way models and attributes and gaps for supporting personalized trip plan, but we also extended it to look at what are the other applications that can benefit from this kind of information. We looked at existing standards and stakeholders related to standardizing reservation scheduling and dispatch capabilities. There's a couple of them, not just in the US with GOFS and TDS that Elliot talked about, but also some in Europe that we looked at. We also looked at the limitations of what those were and where there needed to be some additional capabilities or gaps addressed. We also looked at automating eligibility for services, but we decided this is a topic that isn't ready to be standardized. We need more research. We need some projects to look at, but we did look at research standards and specifications. A lot of this has to do with potentially looking at R&B records, driver's license, or other kinds of private HIPAA information that, so that was a white paper also that we kind of explored what is eligibility and what is eligibility for services and for payment. If you can move on to the next slide. So in particular, when we looked at the public right-of-way, the gaps, we wanted to identify the types of standards that needed to be addressed. So we looked at network models. So we looked at what kind of graph information is needed or what kind of information is needed for different use cases, for just ADA audits, for curb management, and in particular for trip planning and trip execution. We looked at that conflation issue as I forget who mentioned that in the previous, in the comments, but we looked at how do you overlay a public right-of-way model with a road network as an example. We also identified that what Karen had said, you need to come up with your definitions of what your attributes are and what they mean, and come up with an ontology so that if you have multiple definitions or overlapping definitions or orthogonal definitions, you can identify what those are too. And this goes back to the transformation issue. If you go from like an open street sidewalks to a open street map, or from a city GML to open sidewalks, how do you do that? And how do you build those equivalency definitions so that you can make those translations? Metadata, always a major issue. How do you collect that data? What is the quality of that data that you're collecting? Every single attribute needs to have a consistent way of measuring it so that from one data collection to another, it's going to be the same. For GTFS, you have latitude and longitude. The kinds of accuracies are pretty well known. The precision is well known. The resolution is well known. Smoothness of a road, of a pavement, is not well known. The type of bubble layer, mat you have at the intersections, you have definitions, but you might have different impedances associated with those. is there actually a quality measure to measure those? Is it consistent? Is there a standard out there to do that? So those are the kinds of metadata and quality information that we're looking at as well. Compliance tests to make sure that the models that you create and the attributes you create are consistent across the board. GTFS went through this issue with you could have apples and oranges using the same standard that don't even talk to each other. And then performance descriptions and tests as well. So let's go on to the next one, and I'll wrap up really quickly. I also am a US expert on the ISO technical committees. And if you go on to the next one, we're having a workshop in May 18th, where we're going to look at public right-of-ways. One of the ways that ISO deals with this is they explore existing standards and specifications, figure out if there's already a standard that can do this or a specification that can be brought in. What's consistent, what's inconsistent, so at this workshop, we're going to be looking at city GML, the geographic data files, and open sidewalks. And then we're going to have different people talking about the downstream data needs for the kind of data that's collected, personalized journey planning, curb management, and mobility automated vehicle robots. Those are the robots that deliver pizza at college campus. So because this is more of a broader look at public right-of-way and the needs that are related to public right-of-way, not just focused on multimodal and accessible travel. So that's kind of an overview of what we're doing. The Joint Program Office is doing a lot with this area, and looking at addressing this and building some kind of collaborative environment where we can start to tackle these kinds of issues. So if there's any questions.
Please help me by thanking Polly. I'm sorry, Polly, we're running out of time, so we'll have to cut off questions. Okay. Thank you. Up next is Albert Benedict. He is the Center he's the Center and Accessibility Programs Director at for Shared Use Mobility Center based in Chicago, Illinois. Previously, Albert was a board member at Oak-Layden Developmental Services and also held positions at Center for Neighborhood Technology, Wesley's Housing Center. Today, he's going to be talking to us about the DRT data specification and the working group.
Yeah, thank you, Anat, and thank you everyone for this is really a great session or just conference, and I think it's really important too. And specifications and data standards, it's not always evident to unless you're really working in this space. How they do really promote equity and universal access. And so I think helping to build awareness around this is really important. But so I wanted to talk, I just have a few slides, but I wanted to talk about the role that working groups can play in helping to plan and promote data specifications. And so I'll move to the next slide. Anat already kind of touched on this, but real quick, with the Shared Use Mobility Center, we view really working to promote a universal and equitable transit system that serves all users equally. And we see public transit as the center, and then other shared mobility modes really supporting that core infrastructure. But the working group I wanted to talk to you today about is the DRT Data Specifications Working Group. And we focus on all DRT related data specifications, but we're really aimed at fostering and promoting the transactional data specification. And Elliot's presentation was great, and that kind of touched on that a little bit, and some of the data that's transferred within the TDS framework. But the working group, co-led by myself and Jana Lynette from AARP, but we really wanted to create a space for both build awareness on the TDS and the importance of DRT data specifications, but also a place for people to share lessons learned, their experiences with this, challenges they might be experiencing, and also the group offers that collaborative space to help work through solutions, and so it's been really exciting to be a part of that and to see the interest in the data specifications in general, but really the TDS grow, over the years. And just real quick, I just wanted to touch on sort of the origins of the group. And summer of 2020, kind of in the heart of COVID, we met virtually, and 10 participants or so, and it was really just from there it's really grown to over 80 participants that participate in this working group, and I think it just really helps to demonstrate the interest in this, and also how the working group itself can really help to promote that awareness and understanding of what data specifications are and the role they can play, and in particular the TDS and how that can help to coordinate services, demand responsive services. So the group itself meets every 2 months, and it's really a space to sometimes we have guest speakers, and not presented, for example, in one of the meetings, but it's really and then we also offer that space for the pilot projects that are working on implementing the TDS to really give us updates, but then also, again, to talk through the challenges that they may be experiencing. And then the group itself has been really a support structure to collaboratively work through solutions. It started out as public sector, but then, a decision was made very early on that, it's critical that we open this up to the private sector so that they are also a part of this, because it really does take that partnership to move this forward, and that understanding, that collaboration that can occur between the public and private sectors. And so, it's kind of an equal mix right now, but, from public to private, both mobility operators and tech developers, but local and state government are involved, transit agencies, and then we have numerous microtransit mobility providers as part of this, and also, of course, the technology developers that have been increasingly joining the group as these pilots grow, and awareness of the data specification, in particular the TDS, also grows. And I guess the one of the issues, just to touch on, there's often this chicken and egg dilemma where you have a data specification that's out there, but if, in order to really to implement that, and to it does create, you need that environment to create that communication across the agencies to really sort of understand what it is, and what ultimately what we'd be asking to pilot. But real quick, I just wanted to touch on the transactional data specification itself, because that is the group's focus. It was a TCRP 210 report, and it was, in its simplest terms, it's really to enable 2 or more demand responsive providers to coordinate and share trips. In its simplest terms, for example, if one provider cannot make a trip because they just don't have a vehicle available, for example, that trip information can be exchanged electronically to then, so another provider could pick that up and dispatch a vehicle to meet that rider's request. And that can occur with this data standard, with this data specification. It can occur without an email or a phone call at all. It can happen electronically. And it's not a one-time instance of communication, for example. It has a set of protocols that you request a trip, and then there's a confirmation. Somebody confirms that they can make the trip, and so it's really sort of, it's not just, there's this ongoing communication that does occur. And it's modeled after the SUDI standard in the Flex Denmark specifically. And there's a lot of great resources out there, on that, including, from the TCRP technical report to a video that really shows the Flex Denmark system. And that's really the vision that we're striving for, where this microtransit service, demand responsive service is available to all users equally. And with that, there's of course the benefits of a higher quality service, but increased efficiencies, lower cost in terms potentially lower cost, as there's more with those efficiencies can come potentially lower cost. And in Denmark, it's a requirement that in order to participate and provide mobility services, they need to adhere to that SUDI standard. And so in the US, it's a little different, where it's a voluntary and really sort of and that's where the working group comes into play to build awareness, first of all, but then also an understanding of what the TDS is and its potential implications. So I have a graphic here on the right. It shows kind of the TDS in action, if you will. So the top graphic, the way the system currently is now, each time a mobility provider communicates with one another, there's a unique instance where that communication occurs, and that often occurs through an API. And so each time, each of those instances creates additional cost, because they have to develop that framework for that communication to occur. And the model below is the TDS and the interoperability that can occur across providers. And so with that, so you can see how there's one common data language, and each of the providers then plugs into that system, and then that allows for that coordination of trips at a larger scale than that one-off instance that we often see today. So, we wanted to just touch on the governance process, and a lot of things that have already been talked about today. Elliot's presentation, for example, and Polly's presentation in particular, are things that we are working on, and really as a working group, really trying to think through the governance process and how, from performance metrics to how we oversee and manage the updates that are made. So as these, there's a number of pilots currently that are implementing the TDS and testing it out. And so as these pilots mature and they implement and mature, we're really understanding of what it takes to move from theory, being the TCRP 210 report, to practice. And there's, and working through some of those issues as with, both from an agency's perspective, but then also the work coming back and reporting back to the working group and trying to understand what the needs are of the TDS. And so it's really, Jana and I have been kind of leading this effort, but it really is the working group and voluntary contributions that they're making that makes this happen. Ultimately, we do need to find a home other than volunteers to govern this process, but the working group, in order to really sort of have that formalized governance process, the working group has been able to fill that need and fill that gap to move things forward. And so that's really kind of the interim, kind of where we are in terms of, full scale, standard and accepted and has a formal governance to really trying to promote and understand and test it in the field and make adjustments accordingly. We're looking into GitHub to really sort of document those changes, so other agencies that are interested in the TDS don't have to start from square one. So we'll learn from others in the field, it's. But again, just we really are, we have a meeting coming up, an in-person meeting at our Shared Mobility Summit in May in a couple of weeks, and we're intending it to be a roll up the sleeves and dig in and really plot out the next steps for the working group. And as these pilots are in the market, there's really a need to think through some of these what Polly mentioned in terms of, well, how do we measure success? What are some of what are we learning and what needs to be adapted to fit within, so it continue to grow and expand, and of course, how do we document those changes so other agencies can pick up where we kind of left out, where things are at, and if they want to implement it themselves. And so that was really it. I kind of went through everything quickly, but I just wanted to really underscore the how working groups can play a key role in really promoting and building an understanding of data specifications, and of course, if anybody is interested in the TDS or participating in the working group, they please feel free to reach out to me and Jana, and we'd love to. We're always looking for new participants. So thank you.
Great. Thank you. Let's see. Thank you, Albert. Let me see. I guess now I'll be standing here too. Okay. So the long and short of it is that we've been openly mapping pedestrian spaces for several years now, and this is the story of the Open Sidewalks data specification, which is really a data schema. And I'm going to try to answer a number of different questions today, which we are trying to address, which is, firstly, what is the intended purpose of the standard or specification? And with respect to Open Sidewalks, Karen mentioned the 61 million adults living in the US with a disability who face barriers in the public right-of-way. We're going to pick on Google, sorry, sir. As noted, a lot of the times, Google is not aware of where the sidewalks are. And so some assumptions are being made. We know where the roads are, and we look at roads for cars. There's homogeneous needs when it comes to a roadway for a car. It just needs to be paved and yay wide, and we're good to go. And so unfortunately, because of that lack of information about pedestrian spaces, pedestrians have also been modeled by the large cartography, digital cartography field as a slow-moving car. And so we're just moving along the road with the assumption that we have homogeneous needs about the environment. And of course, when it comes to a chair or any other kind of mobility device, the same assumption applies. But these are not slow-moving cars. As pedestrians, we have rather heterogeneous needs about the environment, and those are exactly those data or informational gaps that different pedestrians require when they approach the environment. So how are data producers currently sharing the data? I kind of talked about that earlier. I got this really somewhat useless map. There's a huge cognitive load on me having to address my mobility needs looking at this map. There are better approaches. Others have actually mapped sidewalks before, but it's part of a single neighborhood project and later abandoned. So this is certainly difficult to do. There's no question. But if the tooling is there, and what I want to really stress is the ecosystem is there, we can do this. So what is Open Sidewalks trying to do? First, we talked to a lot of people, like Polly mentioned. This is actually a study done by USDOT to just try to understand, should we really focus on information, or is it just about correcting the infrastructure, right? So a lot of us in this room are sort of split. We know data is important, but how important is it really? Like you asked the question, how much impact with information would actually provide, as opposed to just change all the infrastructure and make everything accessible? And that's where we may need to put our resources. Well, part of the problem is not having this information. You have no idea where to prioritize your resource allocations for fixing the environment. So that's a huge problem in and of itself. But also in talking to the population that requires this data really did highlight the informational gap that they feel is present. So people are aware that they're lacking that data. It's not just that like, oh, I get there and I can't cross. It's if I knew about it in advance, I wouldn't have even come here. And that's really an important part of the equation. So we also did a study on our own and tried to understand, how are people getting around these informational gaps? Are they accessing friends? Are they looking at different types of maps? Like, what is happening on the ground? And it turned out that people on average do 2 hours of research before they face a brand new environment, using all kinds of tooling, including accessing friends and trying to get somebody to steward for you before you get there. And that's a huge onus on people. What else we found is that even in the US DOT study, there was sort of a homogenization of what types of disabilities were represented in that data. So we really wanted to understand, sort of subsegment the population and understand who needs what data. And for that, we actually found there's not, you can't even subsegment the population to say, oh, manual wheelchair users need X, because there was a huge variation even among those subgroups or sub-qualifications. And to us, this actually meant that the data specification itself has to be very detailed and objective, because then I can make a choice based on my daughter's wheelchair width, and Karen can make a different choice, and both of us would be accommodated if, rather than saying, oh yeah, this is a wheelchair accessible path, it says this is a path that is 3 foot wide accessible, and then you can make your choice and I make my choice. And to me, that also addresses the question that was brought up earlier, which is what if accessibility requirements change on the ground in the future? We're sort of future-proofing the data specification by just being super detailed, objective about what is there, what does the infrastructure offer. So access is personal, we learned that. Access is not a binary category. We can't just say this is an accessible path, because that means different things to different people. Access evaluation requires a network, not separate assets in the built environment. And I think I'm totally singing to the choir here, but believe me that I approach rooms sometimes where that is not necessarily an intuitive conclusion. We have to say that. And local communities have different access priorities. We kind of addressed that in answering the question that David Miller put forth. We know that in Seattle, elevation changes make a huge difference to the local community. And so when we worked with the community here, we started mapping, as part of the public right-of-way, accessible indoor buildings that allow you to escalate from one floor to the other. When we're working in Minnesota, Twin Cities, their concerns are all about skyways, because 6 months out of the year, they're under snow, and those are the passages that are important for them. So local concerns have to be part of the data specification, and we have to be able to highlight that and be flexible enough in the schema to accommodate those local regional needs. So how is the standard shared? And I do want to give you lunch. So we have an open sidewalk schema. It is found on opensidewalks.com, where you can click on the little GitHub link on the upper right corner, and that will take you to our GitHub schema for those of you who are using the actual schema itself, but it will also provide you with a wealth of information about at least the basic requirements, and we are continuously building onto that schema. But I did want to say that the principles that I just discussed about open sidewalks really require that there is a connected line network underlying all of this. So if I was just to summarize open sidewalks in 3 sentences, 1, it is objective and detailed data. 2, it requires an underlying graph network that connects 3 types of lines: the sidewalks, the links between the sidewalks and the crossings, And beyond that, we are flexible in terms of how we can accommodate additional geometries and point geometries, and how we tag the different elements in order to satisfy those local and regional concerns. But once you have that line network in place. The world's your oyster. So, and specifically because it allows for routing. And routing is so crucial in understanding connectivity on the ground and how people actually get from place A to place B. So this is a complex pedestrian space. I'm going to zoom through this space just to demonstrate that, yeah, we need to understand all of those barriers on the ground, but to author this, just start with the line work. And to do that, we talk to a lot of different stakeholders because it's not sufficient to say, okay, subpopulations require this information. We need to talk to you guys in the room in terms of how we can actually do the collection at scale. And that meant that we wanted to create an ecosystem, not just a tool to collect the data, but ensure that there is this discourse between data producers in the institutional sense and data producers in the Karen and me sense, that we go out there and we find a barrier and we need to be able to have that conversation with you about it. And we found OpenStreetMap to be a really good place for that kind of democratic discussion, but also that data producers had the need to have released versions of their own data that they could certify and say this is ours and not necessarily volunteer contributed. And so we designed the Open Sidewalk schema in such a way to be compatible with Open Sidewalks, but removable from it so that agencies can feel the confidence that, okay, I've vetted this data, feel good about it. Now, what about all these downstream consumption applications that would enable me to have this conversation with my users about the data, its quality, and my confidence about these data? So I'm going to rush through all of this. 6 years later, we have about 11 cities right now that are partially or completely mapped. We have several ongoing efforts, including the US DOT effort, which will produce complete 6 counties in Washington, Maryland, and Oregon. And that is sponsored by the US DOT ITS for US. But we also have a number of other sponsors, including Microsoft for Latin American cities, and a few other places. I will skip through this because the idea is just this is the connected network. We're going to do this at scale. And how to do it at scale is not just by using editors in OpenStreetMap, although that's been a key contribution, and I should mention that because OSM US is here with us today. But also, we do have machine learning methods of addressing the collections so that agencies are able to at least get the line work at scale in place. And we've been working with King County Metro Access and MV Transit to produce those machine learning methods. Running through. So to summarize, we have a pedestrian network graph, which is the foundation of Open Sidewalks. And then we have attributes on the paths that are decided on and prioritized by local community. And that allows us the kind of flexibility and scaling to improve downstream. And I think I will leave the next section, which is like how are these data being used currently, to our afternoon session when we're going to talk about data consumption by different groups and how that's being done. So thank you so much for joining us for the session today. I wish we could take questions. Maybe we'll take questions over lunch. That would be fun. Okay, thanks so much.